Hey everyone, it's Allie, and I am so excited to bring you what is most likely going to be my single best Leaguestarter guide and build that I've ever played in Path of Exile. Today we're going to be talking about Warden Lightning Strike. This is going to be a classic build that many people have enjoyed over the past few years that's constantly woven in and out of meta. With the new Warden Ascendancy that's going to completely replace Raider, we are going to be given quite a large, hefty suite of increased damage for Lightning Strike, making the only issue that's ever had, low single target damage, not really a problem anymore, meaning that this build is finally ready to come back into meta and just absolutely delete everything. This build is going to be a mapping monster. It's going to be primarily focused on specifically that. You're going to want to choose this build if you are looking to farm a bunch of mapping content in the early few days of the season, but as you push into the mid-game setup of this build, you will actually become so tanky that doing most Maven invitations and pinnacle bosses shouldn't really be too difficult, meaning that you can do boss-related content with this build eventually. This is not going to be a build that's aimed to do all content really well, and instead is going to be a build that's primarily focused on just being able to clear a map in 2 seconds. Lightning Strike's ability to pretty much hit every single monster in a pack while freezing them and having pretty much screen-wide coverage is going to make it a substantially stronger mapper than pretty much every other build that you can imagine. When we combine this with the fact that Warden is going to give it a lot of additional damage at all times through Oath of Summer, this build at an early level should just absolutely tear through everything. The B-roll that you're seeing in the background is of the white map setup in a tier 16 Delirium mirror map. There'll be 2 different setups in this path of building. One is going to be the tier 16 gear that I would expect you to have by the time you get to tier 16 maps, and then the other one is going to be the gear that I expect you to have when you swap over to Lightning Strike at the start of white maps. This white map gear does 1/3 of the DPS of the tier 16 gear, and as you can see, a 400,000 DPS setup is absolutely tearing through pretty much everything in a tier 16 map. This is also not accounting for the new buffs that are coming to everything related to this, as Lightning Strike itself at level 20 is going to do somewhere around 80% more damage than it did in any previous season. Not only that, but this is with a Raider, which is going to be substantially weaker than a Warden, as pretty much everything the Raider Ascendancy was giving me in this B-roll was either covered by Onslaught Hit Boots or Blood Rage. What I need you to take away from the B-roll is to take it with a grain of salt, and just remember that you'll be doing an order of magnitude more damage than what is currently shown here. With all that said, let's get into talking about this build, and the first thing that I want to mention here is going to be the note section for this path of building. This is going to by far be the single biggest Leaguestar path of building that I've ever made. I poured my heart and soul to this, and I would highly appreciate if you take your time and read through everything here, as this will pretty much answer most of the questions that you might have about playing this build. This is also going to include a leveling guide, pretty much going over every single step they need to take to level your character at the start of the season, walking you and explaining every single thing along the way to make sure you have the most comfortable experience you possibly can with leveling. There will also be a section towards the bottom that's going to include a few crafting guides on some important items that you're going to want to craft as you push into red tier maps, as well as some explanations on some of the core concepts in this build and some of the questions that people might have. Everything in this note section will also be covered in this video guide, with the exception of the step-by-step leveling guide, which will only be in the note section specifically. Again, I implore you to please read the note section, as I put a lot of effort into it. So with that out of the way, why don't we start talking about how to level this build? We are going to be primarily leveling from Act 1 to Act 10 with Rain of Arrows. This skill is not only going to share a lot of passive points with Lightning Strike, but it's going to be faster and do more damage than Lightning Strike can at early levels, meaning that you will be able to get to maps substantially faster. In the path of building for this, under the tree section, there will be a tree for every single act of the campaign that's going to show you exactly how you want to allocate your points from Act 1 all the way to Act 10 to be able to play this. At the same time, in the skills section, there will also be a set of skills for every single act, showing you exactly which gems you want at each portion during the campaign. This is going to be in line with what the leveling guide in the note section is going to tell you to do. So this is simply just going to be a reminder of what you want to have during each act. What I want to mention about leveling with Rain of Arrows is going to be that you need to pay attention to your bow, making sure you keep upgrading it to better and better bows as you go along. My loot filter for this build will include a leveling section that is going to show you bows, and all you're gonna have to do is just simply pick them up, ID them, and then check what the elemental DPS of the bow is. We are not going to be converting any physical damage over to elemental, and we're going to be purely an elemental build, meaning that any sort of physical damage on the bow is just completely irrelevant to us. All you need to do is simply just hit Control D on the bow with your Awakened trade, click the little hidden slider, and check what the elemental DPS that Awakened trade says the bow has to see if it's higher or lower than your bow. If it's higher, great, it's an upgrade. If it's not, then just vendor and try to find yourself more bows. As long as you keep doing this, and as long as you go over to your crafting bench and potentially craft any added damage onto your bow if you have an open prefix, or attack speed if you have an open suffix, leveling should be a breeze and you should have 0 issues. The other thing I want to quickly mention in terms of leveling is going to be Trinity. Starting in Act 2, we're going to be picking up Trinity, and we're going to be starting to use it as soon as we get ourselves a 4-link. Trinity is going to fill up your elemental resonance bars for the 2 damage types that were the lowest portion of your hit. For example, if I did 100 fire damage, 80 cold, and 70 lightning damage, the fire damage would be the highest hit, meaning the cold and lightning bars would fill up. What we need to do is we need to alternate between doing 2 elemental types as our highest hit every now and then to make sure that all 3 bars are filled up to make Trinity give you the DPS boost that's meant to give you. This is not going to be too much of an issue, as in Act 3, around when I expect you to get yourself a 4-link, you're going to be running Anger, as well as an added cold damage on your Rain of Arrows, along with a Herald Device, roughly making your cold and fire rolls be similar to each other, meaning that as one of them high rolls and one of the other ones low rolls, they should alternate enough to keep up all 3 of your bars. This is going to potentially become a problem as you upgrade your bow and as you get more elemental damage. As for example, you might find yourself a bow with a very high added cold damage roll on it, drastically boosting your cold damage while your fire damage stays the same. This would mean that on average, your cold damage might be higher than your fire damage is, meaning that your Trinity resonance might not always be topped up. If you ever have any issues with this, and if it's a cold issue, you can simply just turn off Herald Device until you get yourself a different weapon if you are having issues with the cold bar, or you can potentially add in a added lightning damage or swapping your Anger out for a Wrath. It shouldn't be too bad to balance this, but I did want to mention all this here just to make sure that you know how to deal Trinity if you've never played with Trinity before. With all that out of the way, let's talk about the Ascendancy you're going to want for this build. As Warden, we are going to get access to some very powerful nodes early on. In the first lab, we're going to want to pick up ourselves Oath of Summer. This is going to make it so you can't ignite anymore, but instead you're going to be applying Scorches, which are effectively scaling elemental weakness debuffs on the enemies, drastically reducing their elemental resistance. Because we are a precise technique build, we can't crit, so the only way for us to actually ignite is going to be with the little bit of chance to ignite on the point before Oath of Summer. This means you're not going to have consistent shocks on enemies while you're clearing, but due to the sheer amount of hits that Rain of Arrow does, it should very easily be able to keep up both Scorch stacks on every single act boss, giving you a large boost in DPS. Once we swap to Lightning Strike and we become a crit build, because critting innately applies an ailment, we will pretty much apply Scorches to every monster that we encounter. For the second lab, you're then going to want to get yourself Avatar of the Wild. This is going to give you a new skill, Unbound Avatar, and you are going to start passively gaining Unbound Fury stacks every time you inflict an ailment onto an enemy. Once you have 100 of these stacks, you can activate Unbound Avatar to gain 80% more elemental damage for 10 seconds. You're going to primarily be using this on Lightning Strike and Rain of Arrows on any sort of boss that you encounter. And if you do ever fill it up while doing a map or while clearing an area during the campaign, you can also trigger it just to kill everything a little bit faster. Try to do everything you can to build up one of these going into a boss if you know a boss is coming up soon, as this should pretty much allow you to melt it in no time at all. For the third lab, we're then going to be taking Oath of Spring, which is going to rework your shocks from, instead of you having one big shock that scales off your damage, you're instead going to be able to apply up to 50 small shocks that give you effectively 2% more damage per. This is going to be the same thing as Oath of Summer, where you're not going to realistically be seeing many of these while leveling, but once you do swap to Lightning Strike, these will stack up very quickly on bosses. We can expect somewhere around 30 of these at all times, depending on how much attack speed you have. And if you end up using a Ball Lightning Strike when fighting a boss, you should easily be able to get all 50 active at the same time, pretty much doubling your damage after 2 seconds of ramping. Finally, for Uber Lab, you're going to be getting yourself Enduring Suffusion, and this is going to be a point that we'll talk about more in detail in the Tincture section of this guide. For your Pantheon, you are going to want to use Lunaris and Gurthol, as Lunaris gives us reduced elemental damage and movement speed, which are great, and Gurthol gives us reduced physical damage taken, which is really the only defensive layer that we're lacking. As for bandits, you're either going to help Alira or Creighton, depending on what you think is going to be best for you. If you're more of a casual player, or if you're someone who is okay going a little bit slower, but wants a comfier time while going through the campaign, I'd recommend Alira for the 15 all-res. But if you're someone who thinks that their resistances are going to be fine, and you simply just want to get through the campaign as fast as you can, then take Creighton for the 8% movement speed. Eventually, once we get around yellow or red maps, you are going to want to do the vendor recipe to swap your bandit over from whatever you picked to Aramir, as the 1 passive point will be better, but Alira or Creighton are going to be really good for the campaign and for early white and yellow maps, make your progression a lot faster. Finally, with all the leveling out of the way, let's talk about how you would actually swap over to Lightning Strike. So there's only going to be 3 things that you need. 1, you're going to need a leveled Lightning Strike, which is not going to be an issue if you bought one in Act 1 and put in your offhand so it slowly gained experience as you got through the campaign. 2, you're going to need a Night Blade, which is going to be the same thing as Lightning Strike, except you buy from from Siosa in Act 3. And then finally, 3, you're going to need to get yourself a half decent claw to have enough DPS to justify swapping a Lightning Strike. By half decent claw, I am really stretching that definition, as I expect you to literally swap to Lightning Strike with the most garbage claw imaginable. What I am expecting you to have is going to be at minimum a 200 elemental DPS claw that is going to have attack speed on it. My loot filter will also start showing you claws as you start getting close to Act 10, and as long as you pick up pretty much every claw that you see, you're most likely going to ID something that is higher than 200 elemental DPS, meaning you should have no issues. You can also go to trade and try to find yourself a claw off a trade. It shouldn't be too difficult. Just keep in mind that you're going to really want to make sure it either has an open suffix for attack speed, or the claw itself does have attack speed, because your build is going to definitely feel very clunky without it. If you end up using a claw without attack speed, that's completely fine. Just do keep that in mind and make sure that you try to find attack speed ASAP, as it'll make a night and day difference in how the build feels. Now, there is a very important mechanic that we need to discuss once you swap over Lightning Strike that will massively increase the damage that you do to bosses. Lightning Strike is a two-part skill where you have both a melee attack and a projectile attack. For pretty much all the content that we're doing, we're going to be focusing on that projectile attack, but because we are taking multi-shot and the +1 additional strike mastery on it, we are going to be summoning a ghost of ourselves that's also going to be casting full value lightning strikes on any nearby enemy. What we could do with this ghost is stand slightly outside of a boss's melee range and attack with our lightning strike towards the boss, hitting it with our projectile while we spawn our clone in melee range, which is going to hit the boss with a melee attack. Because the melee attack cannot benefit from point blank, that is why it only does 80% of the damage of projectile, but because it is full value, that is just 80% more damage that you're going to be doing. This Goldilocks zone, where you are either too close to the boss for the clone to not spawn or too far away for the clone to not be able to target the boss, is fairly large and pretty forgiving. So simply just go fight a bunch of map bosses with this in mind, where you're slightly out of range of their melee hitbox, and you will see two separate beams of lightning coming down from the top of your screen to where both your character and your clone is, right on top of the boss, which signifies that this is working correctly. It should be very intuitive, and I highly encourage you to make sure that you do this as much as you can, otherwise you will not be doing the full damage that you should be doing on bosses. As for the respec over to Lightning Strike itself, it's going to be about a 26-point respec. You're going to be gaining about 14 of these posit points for just doing the campaign, and you're most likely going to find a regret or two along the way. The final few points are either going to be taken care of by more regrets as you start pushing into the campaign, or by going over to the new league mechanic and using your gold, which is a new currency in 3.25, to respec your points that way. We do not know how much gold you're expected to have by Act 10, and we don't know how expensive the respecs are going to be as a skill with level, but I'm gonna guess you're gonna most likely be able to respec at least a few passive points with the gold you've accumulated, so make sure you go use it, as we don't really need it for anything else early on. As you push into maps, presumably your gold gains are going to drastically increase, meaning that very quickly in white maps you should have more than enough gold to cover the rest of the respec if you couldn't fully respec. In terms of respec itself, if you simply just come to the path of building and turn on the Act 10 tree, click the compare button, and then simply compare it to the mapping level 70 Lightning Strike swap tree, you'll very clearly see in green all the points that you're going to want to pick up, and then in red all the points that you're going to want to drop. This should hopefully make it very easy for you to swap over your passive tree. And if you want to talk about things that you're going to want to look for while going through white and yellow maps, you're mostly just going to want to try and get yourself some spell suppression on your gear to spell suppress cap without the lucky mastery, while at the same time just looking for resistances and life on all of your gear. You can try to find yourself attack speed on both your gloves and your shield, as they'll make your build feel even better, but outside of life and resistances, there really isn't much that you need. Try to keep picking up claws and identifying them, or try to keep looking for new claws off of trade, as a better claw will be the biggest thing you could do to increase your DPS. There are also going to be 2 unique items that you can utilize in the early game to make your character even stronger. Carnage Heart is going to be an amulet that's going to be worth at most 5 chaos, and this thing is just amazing for early game. It has a lot of all attributes on it, making it substantially easier to not have any issues with any sort of attribute requirements you might have, while at the same time giving you a hefty amount of increased damage while leeching, which we'll always be doing given we're always going to be mana leeching, and a lot of elemental resistances. This amulet is just way too good early on, so if you can get your hands on one of these, definitely do, as this thing will carry you for quite a while and can even be used for red maps as a pretty solid amulet. The other unique item you're going to want to keep in mind is going to be the taming. Now, taming is going to be a little bit expensive at the start of a season, and I'm going to most likely assume these are going to be around a div or so after a day or two. They're going to be really cheap at the start of day 1, so if you can grab yourself one for 20-30 chaos within the first few hours, I definitely would, as these are going to be best in slot for quite a while style, even into deep red map progression, as you're starting to do whatever farming strat you want to once you finish up your Alice progression. And because of that, and because of how they're going to go up in price, definitely try to get yourself one of them. If you can't, that's fine. Just use some rare rings with added damage on it and it'll be no issue. But taming is going to give you a very large DPS boost. Finally, we have Dark Ray Vectors, which you're either going to love or hate. Some people are not going to like them because you are not going to have any movement speed when you don't have frenzy charges, meaning on bosses where we cannot generate any, you'll be really slow. But these will give you +1 maximum frenzy, giving you a lot more damage, and their movement speed is pretty comparable with a high tier movement speed roll on boots. These are purely optional, so if you don't like the sound of potentially clunky movement speed for more upfront damage, don't go for them and just run yourself a rare pair of boots. And finally, let's talk about the gear you're going to want in this build. There are going to be 2 different item sets in the item section of the Path of Building. There's going to be a red map gear, which is going to be the gear that you're going to want to aim for as you start making money. And then the Lightning Strike swap gear, which is going to be a default set of gear that is effectively going to be reminiscent of about the gear I expect you to have from leveling through the axe at this point. In terms of what you're going to be aiming for eventually, as I mentioned, you're going to keep wanting to upgrade your claw as much as you can, with elemental DPS and attack speed being the 2 main things that you want to care about. Ideally, you're going to want to find yourself one that also has crit chance on it, as that would give you a massive DPS boost. Eventually, once you do get to red maps and get yourself a little bit of money, you're going to want to go and buy yourself a fractured claw that has either fractured, added fire, cold, or lightning on it. And then you're going to want to use shrieking essences of one of the 2 elemental types that you do not have, and use that until you hit all 3 elemental prefixes with an open suffix for you to craft attack speed. There will be an exact crafting guide on how to make this claw at the bottom of the note section, as well as a trade link that's going to show you a base that you could buy to craft your claw from. This is going to cost you maybe around a div or 2 to do, and this claw should be more than enough to get you through pretty much most of the content they're going to be doing for the first few days. As for a shield, you're going to be doing the same thing, where you're just going to try to get yourself an attack speed shield, either by just buying one off a trade or getting yourself some life essences and spamming life essences on your shield until you hit the attack speed roll. If you end up getting any sort of other useful stats, great. And at the end, if you can, try to craft accuracy rating, as we do have a slight accuracy problem in this build. For your helmet, what you're going to be wanting to do is getting yourself some loathing mana reservation essences immediately and using them on your helmet to get yourself reservation efficiency. You're then going to also want to get yourself some Eater World Ichors and try to put mana reservation efficiency of skills on your helmet. You're eventually going to need a shrieking roll along with a grand roll to be able to swap from precision over to using anger, purity of elements, and determination. For your chest plates, all you're going to really worry about is getting yourself a 6-link chest plate ASAP. Ideally, you'd find yourself a Triumphant Lemnar, but any sort of pure evasion base or armor evasion hybrid works, and you're going to try to get yourself a big life roll if you can, and ideally a little bit of spell suppression. You're not going to need much spell suppression to cap this build, as most of it is going to be taken care of by your passive tree, but in total, at the start on day 1, you are going to try and get yourself at least 18% total spell suppression across all of your gear. Eventually, you will want to get yourself 35% across all of your gear, as that will allow you to drop the Entrenched node, and this can either be achieved by getting spell suppression rolls on multiple pieces of gear, or getting a bunch of Tattoo of the Ramako Shaman and replacing some of your dex nodes, since we have way too much dexterity in this build, with some of them. The tattoos are going to be pretty pricey at the start of the season, but they are something to keep in mind if you're a few percent off of getting to 100%. This is not something you're going to have to immediately do, and just getting 18% to hit 100% without the lucky mastery is enough, but being able to get 2 passive points back from Entrenched later on is going to be a nice upgrade to your build. For the gloves, we're simply going to try to get ourselves a fractured resistance on our gloves, and then simply just use a few Zeal attack speed essences until we roll a resistance that we need, and then finally craft life on them to finish them. You're ideally going to try to use Eldritch Currency to get yourself non-vol skills, strike 1 additional nearby enemy, which will give you a pretty nice amount of additional clear. And then you could either run Projectiles Pierce an additional target, or Spell Suppression chance with the Eater Worlds Implicit, based on what you feel like you need. You don't necessarily need this +1 Pierce, as you're going to have +3 Pierce from the passive tree, but in some cases, this Pierce might actually be useful and give you a little bit better clear, especially in super high dense maps, so just pick whichever one seems better for you. Finally, for our boots, these are going to be what we're going to be using to Ailment cap us later to allow us to drop Purity of Elements for a different aura. To begin with, you're going to just simply keep Purity of Elements, but eventually, you're going to want to get yourself a Storm Shroud, and then you're going to want to craft your boots with Avoid Elemental Ailments as a Eldritch Implicit, and use a Avoid Elemental Ailments essence on them to get yourself at minimum 46% Elemental Ailments reduction from your boots. And then when this is combined with the 20% from the Thickskin Wheel and a 44% or higher roll on a Abyss Jewel, you'll be at 100% chance to avoid shocks meaning that Storm Shroud will make you Ailment immune. In order to craft the pair of boots for this swap over to Storm Shroud, all you're gonna do is get yourself a Fractured Chaos Resistance, Life, or Movement Speed pair of boots, and then simply just use some Avoid Elemental Ailments essences on them until you either hit Life or Movement Speed, and then finishing off the craft by crafting the other one. This is assuming that you are getting a minimum roll on a Shrieking Avoid Elemental Ailments Essence and a minimum roll on the Avoid Elemental Ailments Implicit. If you get better rolls on this, you are going to need a lower chance to avoid shocked roll on your Abyss Jewel, but as long as you can hit 100%, you will be Ailment immune. As I mentioned, this is not something you need to do immediately, but this will be a very nice upgrade for you to do once you're situated in red maps and once you are making money. Finally, for your flasks, you're going to want to run a life flask, and ideally, you're going to be putting Corrupting Blood immunity here, as we don't really have a lot of gem sockets to begin with in this build, so we don't have space to get a Corrupting Blood jewel until later. You're then going to ideally want to run a Granite Flask, as Armor is going to honestly be the only defensive layer that we're really missing. A Diamond Flask, because we want it 100% critical strike chance, and it's going to greatly help with it. A Quicksilver Flask, as movement speed is just really nice. And then finally a Tincture. For the suffixes, you're going to want to try to find yourself increased armor, critical strike chance, and attack speed during effect. Next, let's talk about Tinctures. Tinctures are a new item that are coming back from the Affliction League that are equipable in your flask slot. They are being reworked from how they used to work back in Affliction to where they will now be activatable. They will give you a debuff called Mana Burn, which is going to degen your mana harder and harder and harder until you run out of mana to where they deactivate themselves. A lot of people have been very misinformed on Tinctures in terms of how useful and how powerful they're going to be. And I just want to quickly go over everything so you know exactly how to use it and why it's going to be important to this build. Because we're a Warden, we are going to get access to Enduring Suffusion. This is going to make it so whenever your Tincture turns off, it's going to linger for half a second per mana burn stack that you had up to 6 seconds. This means you want to get yourself to 12 mana burn stacks before it falls off, because all Tinctures are either going to have a 6-second cooldown or an 8-second cooldown. We are most likely going to be using a Critical Strike Tincture, and with practice reapplication, the 25% cooldown recovery rate will reduce the cooldown from 8 to 6 seconds, meaning Enduring Suffusion will completely cover the downtime of the Tincture, giving you all of your Tincture effects at all times. At the same time, we're then going to want to get ourselves the Tincture Mastery that makes it so the first 6 mana burns applied to us have no effect, meaning once we get the 7th stack of mana burn, we're finally going to start losing 1% of our mana per second. In this build, we're going to be trying to do everything we can to hover around 10% unreserved mana, meaning by the time we get to 12 stacks of mana burn, we're going to be losing 6% of our mana, which when combined with the around 20% of our mana per second that we're gaining from Mana Leech, not only are you honestly going to be able to ignore it, allowing yourself to get upwards to 16 mana burn stacks before it actually falls off, but it's going to make it so you don't really care too much about the mana burn. And then as soon as the Tincture deactivates itself, as soon as it's ready to come back up again, you can press it again, and assuming you somewhat pay attention to your Tincture and activate it somewhat around the time it came off a cooldown, I can expect the average player to have 90 to 95% uptime on whatever Tincture they use. We're also going to be anointing Nature's Concoction onto our Tincture. This is going to make it so the 2 adjacent flasks next to the Tincture will gain 2 charges every time you hit an enemy with a weapon, no more than once every second. We are going to want to make sure that our Tincture is going to go between our Granite and our Diamond flask, which are going to have reduced charges per use as your prefixes, and assuming you are constantly hitting enemies, Nature's Concoction should easily be able to let you have 100 or near 100% uptime on both the Granite and Diamond flask. With all this put together, you'll have a super strong Tincture, and unfortunately, because we don't know all the mods on the Tinctures, I cannot tell you exactly what Tincture you're going to want to go for, but just pick up a bunch off the ground as they drop and just simply use whatever seems best to you. A few days after the league launches, I will make a follow-up video to this that's going to talk about Tinctures in more detail once all of the Tincture mods have been data mined and once I've gotten a chance to play with it a little bit. And with all of that, you should know everything you need to know about playing this build on launch. I am so unbelievably excited to play this, as Lightning Strike is one of my favorite skills. I've played it multiple times in the past. It's a very fun skill to scale, as our end game is most likely going to be an Omniscience build, meaning that we just want to stack as many attributes everywhere as we can. I am very excited to play this on launch, and if you do end up playing this yourself, I hope you do enjoy playing it with me, and I hope you have a wonderful time with it. If you have any questions, please feel free to leave a comment in the comments below, and I'd be more than happy to help you as soon as I can. I also stream on Twitch every day, and I'm going to be obviously playing this build on launch. So if you want to see me play it, or if you want to ask any questions about it, feel free to come by my stream and ask me any questions you have there. Or if you simply just want to come and hang out with all the cuties in my community, you're more than welcome to come along as well. With all I said, I hope you cuties enjoyed this video. I hope you have a wonderful 3.25 league launch, and I hope to see you all in the next video.